When I was a child, I always wanted to be a teacher. But when I was 11, I decided that I could help more people if I became a doctor. I've always loved medicine, but during my adolescence I read a book which disturbed me greatly called On the Beach, and it was about a nuclear war which occurred in the northern hemisphere and everybody died, and gradually the radioactive cloud moved down to the southern hemisphere. The only people left alive on the earth were people living in Melbourne, and that's where I lived. And eventually everybody died in Melbourne. And that book moved me and has been with me for the rest of my life. I'm now 41. I've read everything in the papers that have appeared about nuclear weapons and nuclear testing, and my fear has grown as I've watched the build-up of nuclear bombs throughout the world. I did medicine when I was 17. I graduated when I was 23. I love medicine. It's like a vacation. But now I really can't see any point in practicing medicine anymore when it's predicted by many great scientists that our chances of surviving to the year 2000 are less than 40%. And probably the chances are even less than that. I see that the role that physicians have to play these days is to prevent nuclear war occurring, because it will probably destroy all of us. And after all, if we are devoted to saving life, surely we must save all lives. How did I get involved in nuclear power? Well, it was a direct outcome of the nuclear arms race, in fact. In 1971, I lived in Australia, and France was blowing up bombs in the Pacific Ocean in the atmosphere. Now, Russia and America and England had signed a partial test ban treaty saying that they would not blow up bombs in the atmosphere. France had not signed that treaty. France had decided to build a nuclear arsenal of its own, and so it came down to the Pacific Ocean and started blowing up bombs over the little atolls that it owned. First it removed the native population and then started blowing up bombs. Now when you blow up an atomic bomb, the fallout moves in the stratosphere from west to east, dropping around various parts of the hemisphere. The fallout in the northern hemisphere doesn't mix with the fallout in the southern hemisphere. Because Russia and America have blown up a lot of bombs, the northern hemisphere has a high level of fallout, the southern hemisphere has little. But the French added to our fallout, and I lived in Australia at that time, in South Australia, and our radioactive levels went from a measurement of 5 picocuries per litre in the rainwater to 1,860 picocuries. Now in South Australia where I lived, it's a very dry climate, and people collect water in tanks, and this radioactive rain fell following a drought, and so the tanks were empty. So they filled up with relatively radioactive rain. I was asked to speak on a news show one night on television about the effects of fallout, and as I'd done medicine and I knew something about strontium-90, I spoke about the fact that strontium-90, when it occurs in fallout, concentrates thousands of times in the grass, thousands more times in the milk and the meat as the cattle eat the grass or the sheep eat the grass. Then people eat the meat and drink the milk, eat the cheese, and they then concentrate the strontium-90 thousands more times in their own bodies. Now when, for instance, you drink milk containing strontium-90, the body thinks it's calcium, and the bones are made of calcium, so the strontium-90 is deposited in the bones, where it irradiates a few cells for many years, and one day that person may develop a cancer. I also said that babies are about 20 times more sensitive to the effects of radiation than adults. Well, every time the French blew up another bomb, I was asked back on television to talk about fallout. So as they blew up a lot of bombs, I had a large exposure, and people quickly learned that fallout was not good for them. And in 9 months, the Australian people rose up en masse to protest against the French test. There were spontaneous marches in the capital cities in the street every weekend. Australia usually doesn't protest like this. Australia is a very quiet country. Many people aren't very politically aware. They don't know who their politicians are. They sunbake a lot. We're a nation of surfies. We drink a lot of beer. We gamble a lot on the races. And we don't get involved in politics. But somehow the Australians were very angry that the French should be coming down to our southern hemisphere, called a nuclear-free zone, blowing up bombs in the air. At the end of 9 months of protesting, 75% of Australians were opposed to the French tests, and I was asked to go to Paris with the Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Jim Cairns, to see the French government. Actually, he was about to become the Deputy Prime Minister. And so we went to see the French government, and we said, "Why are you blowing up bombs?" And they said, "Well, our bombs are perfectly safe." So we said, "If they're perfectly safe, why don't you blow them up in the Mediterranean?" And they said, "Mon Dieu, there are too many people living around the Mediterranean." So for the first time in my life, I realized I was sitting opposite politicians who really didn't give a damn if a few Australian children developed leukemia or cancer as a result of their atomic testing. So I learned a big lesson then. I realized that probably many politicians throughout the world think like this, and that they're interested in power, nationalism, and they're not really interested in people. And I really care very deeply about people because I was doing pediatrics at the time, and I saw children dying of leukemia and cancer, and that's a very profoundly moving experience. Every single human life is precious. Well, eventually the wrath of the Australian people and the New Zealand people was so great that both those countries took France to the International Court of Justice, and France, because of the bad international publicity, now tests her bombs underground, which was a partial victory. Then 2 years later, it was discovered that Australia had vast amounts of uranium. Now, Australia is a very, very old continent, and all the mountains have been washed away, and many minerals are lying exposed to the surface, like